convidat preparat, que no és un altre que Bruce Whitehill, so we're going to do this interview in English, so we're going to try to translate it simultaneously, I don't know how.
Yeah, little by little, right? Anem a fer l'entrevista
Bruce, welcome.
Well, first of all, Bruce,
Hello,
thanks a lot
Carla.
for coming.
Carlos.
Thanks a lot.
Remember?
You remember our names, that's all.
Yes, but you had masks on.
Yeah, that's right, that's right. We were like superheroes, so now you're seeing a true identity. Estem comentant que anem a fer l'entrevista en anglès i anirem parant i traduint a mesura que avancem. Aleshores, ens havien conegut ja, el que ens ha comentat en anglès és que ens havia conegut, però que les mascaretes, no? I que ara ja és una altra cosa. Aleshores, potser, no sé si vols començar amb l'entrevista i faig jo alguna traducció, perquè començo jo.
Yes. So, Bruce Whitehill is known to be a big game hunter, a collector, right? An historian and a game inventor for more than 35 years. And you mentioned that all of this was driven by curiosity.
Yes.
Sí,
The research it takes to put a good game together or to collect something, you have to be curious about how things are connected.
Sí, la pregunta era un poquet que tota la tasca que fa el Bruce com a historiador, com a col·leccionista, està portada per la curiositat. Bruce confirma que realment és la curiositat la manera que té de poder continuar fent aquestes coses i la força que li dona. So, one thing that's interesting perhaps in the hobby, in board gaming, is this sometimes discussion whether board gamers are playing or are collecting sometimes, right? Within the hobby, they are buying stuff but perhaps not playing. I don't know if you have a perspective on that because our time is limited and we have so much time.
The space is limited.
And the space is limited as well. So, how do you complement both things, like playing and also collecting and knowing about games?
I started as a collector after I started researching about certain games. And in the mid-1980s, I founded a group of American game collectors. And we were all buying more and more games and collecting. And then we started having conventions. And it was only, I don't know, after a few years when we started talking and realized that nobody was playing any of the games. That wasn't the idea.
That wasn't the goal at all.
That wasn't the plan, no. We were collecting games for their history, for their artwork, for the interesting materials that were used. And then when we started learning about games, we also learned that some of these really early games are fun to play. Some of these games have been played for 5,000 years. So we developed an interest in playing, and more people who were collectors started to play. When I became more of a player and played modern games and wound up marrying a serious player, my wife Sybil, we would go with a group of people who were serious players, and I'd say, do you collect games? And they would say, no, not really. Well, how many do you have? Well, maybe 300. Well, 300 games, in my world, you're a collector, right? Yeah. So the players don't think in terms of collecting, and the collectors don't think in terms of playing, but there is that overlap.
I see.
Yeah.
Estàvem comentant un poquet aquesta diferència entre col·leccionar i jugar dins del hobby, no? Moltes vegades tenim aquesta discussió de que si estàs comprant però no tens temps per a jugar i volíem volíem sentir la seva perspectiva. Bruce ha comentat que ell vas començar buscant jocs, comprant-los i col·leccionant-los, i cap a mitjans de 1980 es va trobar amb altra gent que estava fent aquesta tasca, i aleshores va haver un moment en què es preguntaren: escolta, tots aquests jocs que estàs col·leccionant, realment els jugues? I n'hi ha un moment en què eren: no, realment els estem col·leccionant perquè ens dona plaer tindre-los, referenciar-los, veure les il·lustracions, són objectes interessants en si mateix que tenen també un llegat cultural. I en aquest sentit, quan comença a fer-se cada vegada més aficionat a jugar, també des que es casa amb la seva dona, doncs en aquest moment, quan es comença a juntar-se amb gent que juga més bé que col·lecciona, els pregunta: i que tu col·lecciones? I diuen: no, jo no col·leccione, però quants jocs en tens? I fa: no, en tinc en casa, en tinc 300. I dius:
ho negarem.
Això és una col·lecció, no? Aleshores, certament sembla, diu, que n'hi ha gent que col·lecciona i a banda juga, i n'hi ha gent que juga i a banda col·lecciona, i que n'hi ha, diguem-ne, una mena de sobrelapament entre aquestes dues cultures d'apropar-se als jocs. Perhaps an interesting thing when we talk about collecting is how we classify that. You wrote an essay, a paper, on a system for classifying games at different stages. Indoor games, outdoor games, then different layers of that until you get to board games, which you classify at different stages. We could go about it in detail.
Right,
Because I believe
it starts here, works its way,
exactly.
An upside-down pyramid, yes.
And regarding that, for instance, librarians are known to do these kind of tasks with how to organize knowledge. How do you approach that? What were your thought process when you were applying these to games?
I started with the work of very famous people who preceded me by a long time. Stuart Coolin, who was in the late 1800s, early 1900s, came up with classifications. And so what I was doing was not starting from scratch, but refining what I thought they had done to add the types of gaming that's played today, the types of games that are made today, and to make distinctions that I thought were more relevant in today's world.
No, sí, bàsicament.
Sí, Carles estava comentant sobre un article que havia escrit Bruce de la classificació dels jocs, comparant la tasca que fan a les biblioteques classificant i els sistemes de classificació que se fan als llibres i al coneixement. I ens estava comentant que ell no havia començat de zero, estava basat en uns treballs previs i l'havia intentat adaptar afegint altres classificacions als jocs moderns i el que s'estava fent en aquest mateix moment.
And at that time, even when I did the classification, which was not that long ago, we didn't have terms like worker placement game.
Exactly.
And collectible card games.
Yeah.
And all, when you have a new type of game, then you have to find a place to add it into the history and into the classification.
No, comenta que quan va fer aquella classificació, que no es fa tant de temps, no hi havia termes com els que existeixen ara per a worker placement.
Sí, col·locació de treballadors.
Gràcies, que si no agafes l'anglicisme ja seria el colmo, no? Traduint en anglicismes. Col·locació de treballadors o jocs de cartes col·leccionables, no? I que realment això fa també expandir un poquet la classificació. Our next question was going to be actually about that, is what kind of innovations have you identified in board game creation that could set a new category or think about different ways to categorizing games. I'm thinking, for instance, games that break, games that you only use once. Should that be a different category? Is that enough entity?
Yes, it is a new category. All of a sudden, within the last, 2 years or so, inventors have come out with games that you play them once and that's it. You can't play them again because you know how everything works.
Yep.
In most of these games, you're, in a sense, playing against the game
Yep.
more than you are playing against another player. Sometimes.
Exactly.
One of the things that was, I think, a result of the pandemic
Yep.
is there are so many people staying at home alone that companies said, well, why can't we take these games that are for 2, 3, 4 players and find a way that they can be played by one? So the last half dozen games that I looked at, they are all saying 1 to 4 players or 1 to 6
5,
players.
absolutely.
1 to 5. So so that is, it's not necessarily a new classification, but it's a new way that games are being looked at, new way that they're being played, and a new way that inventors are trying to approach creating games for the public.
Hem preguntat per noves coses que han passat des de que va proposar una classificació, no? I coses que han passat que poden tindre entitat suficient com per a ser mereixedors d'una nova categoria o una nova perspectiva, no? Revisió de la classificació. I doncs, durant la conversa han sorgit jocs d'un solus, gràcies.
I el solo,
I els jocs
el mode
solitaris.
solitari que està ara tan present en tots els nous jocs que si vas ara a les caixes del joc te trobes de 1 a 5 jugadors, de 1 a 4, de 1 a 6, ara sempre està. I no és una altra nova categoria per se, però sí que és una nova via que s'està explorant.
Regarding how to look at classification, it is interesting that you mentioned that different people would classify things differently. Publishers would classifying according to the target audience.
Right.
Then you would have historians which would classify according to place of origin or time or period, things like that.
Every way is legitimate.
Every way is legitimate. And then you have hobby users or hobby players that classify them in very fine-tuned ways of mechanics, for instance. Regarding this, for instance, regarding the user or the player's approach, how does a site, a website like Board Game Geek, which actually works kind of a database for the whole hobby, have an impact on even how we identify or how we look at the whole spectrum of games? Does it have an impact to the classification of the website? Does it have an impact on how do we see games? Can classification be that important?
Do you have any easier questions?
We can go to the easier questions later.
No. Board Game Geek has now established itself as the place to go for information. But it's more than just the information about the game's history and how it plays. It's information about how the game is received.
Absolutely.
Whether that's always correct or not, that's a different question. But it carries a lot of weight because the people that are making the comments, the review, the self-reviewers, are the ones who are adding the information about the likes and dislikes of a particular game. But that's coming from their perspective of normally serious players, because it's the more serious people who will be looking at Board Game Geek. There's a whole different group of players out there that never go to Board Game Geek because that's
a bias, but we are not going to get into that bias.
If it looks good being advertised on television or sitting on a table and you hear about it, well, why not? We'll try it. I don't know if I answered your question.
Okay, it's an interesting discussion. Just wanted to open that up. Podem traduir-ho, pot ser. Bàsicament, la idea era preguntar sobre Board Game Geek, la pàgina web que serveix com una mena de base de dades de jocs i que alhora proposa una classificació. I com aquesta classificació...
I premis en aquesta classificació.
Premis en aquesta classificació, i la pregunta era si realment els usuaris veuen distorsionada d'alguna manera o modificada la representació de tot l'abanic que n'hi ha de jocs per el propi fet que existís aquesta classificació d'una manera tan prominent. Per començar, ens ha dit que si no teníem preguntes més fàcils, que ja, o si se pot anar a casa o alguna cosa així, perquè ja s'està passant. Però, davant d'això, ha comentat que no és només aquest sistema de base de dades, sinó que té una cosa, Board Game Geek té una cosa molt important, que és que es gasta com a sistema de valoració per part dels jugadors, amb els autoproclamats ressenyadors, i un sistema de dir això m'agrada, això no m'agrada, i que això té un impacte també molt fort que alhora està esbiaixat per qui acudeix a aquest tipus de webs a discutir sobre això.
So now you, as a big game hunter, when you came to an event like the Dau Barcelona, what are you looking for in an event like this?
When you say an event like Dau Barcelona, I don't know if there are too many events like Dau Barcelona.
Okay, so what makes it special then?
A games festival, what makes this special is you see so many different types of players, from little children to serious players, depending on what room you're in. I'm still looking for a chance to get out to where the little kids are throwing bowling pins at bowling pins.
Yeah, we do. We'll go later, okay?
It's just lots of kids there. I can't get in. So my approach to most of these places, actually I'm wearing two hats, as we say in English. One is I'm often trying to interest a company in one of my products, but I'm also looking to see what's out there that would be interesting to play. And you don't go to a fair to find collectibles usually, but then there might be something, an older collectible that somebody has that they're selling with all the new stuff they have. So you're always looking, but that's not the place to find collectible games.
No, bueno, la pregunta... sí.
No sé.
Te lo digo yo, tú me complementes. La pregunta anava un poquet per què busca o què troba a events com Dau Barcelona, la qual cosa ha dit que events com Dau Barcelona no n'hi ha dos, no n'hi ha un altre com este. Li he preguntat què feia especial realment, i deia també el tipus de gent que s'untava, que n'hi havia gent tan diferent, xiquets, i gent que diu serious gamers, gent que juga seriosament als jocs, que s'ho pren en sèrio, és segurament la seva afició principal. També deia que sobre el que fan els xiquets al festival, que té moltes ganes d'anar a la zona de...
El joc tradicional, que estan així fora, que se sent de quan en quan xillar.
I jugar a billes, no? Potser podem anar després. I des del punt de vista de col·lecció, etc., també comentava que de vegades en alguns tipus d'events pots trobar algunes coses, però que també tenen diferents perspectives i diferents objectius. One thing that perhaps is interesting is regarding your perspective on culture through history. Culture, the cultural aspect of games through history. And it's very clearly understandable that, for instance, we can follow American culture through music, for instance.
Yes.
Right? I like music very much, and I can see how jazz started and how it developed.
I knew you were thinking about the la literal.
How it developed, how it entered the rock and roll and the pop culture and everything like that, and how that's actually bound to changes in society. Literature is even perhaps more obvious because they are written words, right? What does board games as cultural artifacts actually tell us about history and society, especially American culture?
A lot of things. But there's a range of information, some of it related, some of it not. First, you look at the history of games before manufacturing, and then you have cultures in which all they had were the tools to carve games in stone, for example.
Yep.
And that's a very specific kind of history. Then you get into the beginnings of game manufacturing, which basically started when printing became easier, and you could do paper and produce items in paper without any difficulty. And so games started to be produced. Now, they weren't just for children, but a lot of the games were of an educational nature, and at a certain period in time, especially American history, they had a religious base.
Okay.
Because that's what was important in the culture at the time.
Yep.
But one of the interesting things you find is that games can come from an actual event. So you can follow the events of history by the games that were made that talked about that event.
Okay.
I'm going to need some water.
Yes, algo, por favor.
Agua,
Desde-
¿queda alguna?
Gracias.
Con permiso.
No problem. Thank you. I believe we have bottle over here.
Good.
Potser podem anar,
Thank you.
anar traduint.
Sí.
Fins ara, la pregunta, sí, la pregunta parlava sobre com els jocs, no? Igual que altres
Components
components culturals
la
reflexen...
música i els llibres poden reflexar a través d'estos components culturals la història, no?
Sí.
En determinats moments de la història. I estem preguntant-li com fan això els jocs. I ens estava comentant particularment en Amèrica, no? Com això quedava reflectit, però s'ha quedat...
Sí, ha començat a parlar des dels jocs que
Des del
fas
principi.
en pedres, claro,
Pre-
abans de publicar, no? Industrial.
Industrial, preèpoca industrial.
Que ho feien potser en pedres, no?
Quan va començar el paper, que ahir estava molt lligat als temes educatius i especialment en Amèrica lligat als termes religiosos.
I fins ahí s'han quedat.
Fins ahí s'han quedat.
And I wanted to add that culturally you can see things in terms of who's playing
Who
games.
is playing?
Who is playing games. So if you compare, things may have changed now, but 20 years ago, if you compared players in Europe, mostly Germany, which was a very strong game center, to players in the United States, you'll find 50% of the players in Germany are women. In the United States, it's less than 10%. So that tells you something about at least the game culture, if not the society as a whole. That you had so many more men playing in games than women. That's changing slowly, but there's still that disparity, which is greater in the United States than it is here in Europe. Don't ask me why. That's another book.
Okay, we'll wait for that then.
Ens estava també comentant Bruce que un altre aspecte en el que podem veure diferències culturals reflectides en els jocs és els jugadors, la quantitat de jugadors que n'hi ha, homes i dones, que aquesta diferència és molt més gran als Estats Units, que només un 10% són dones, mentre que 50-50, la meitat són dones en Alemanya, i que avui en dia encara està aquesta diferència canviant per sort, però no sabem, no anem a entrar en els detalls de per què.
Sí, exacte. We had some questions actually regarding that, but you already gave a very nice example about the regions, right? Difference about regions and board games tell us these kind of differences. I don't know if you have any other thing that you could mention about that, because at the end we are humans living in a world that is divided by territory, right? And we like to think that we are our own special kind, right? And that my thing is different than yours and things like that. You mentioned the difference between Germany and the US regarding the gender ratio in the hobby. Any other things that come to mind when you think about games in other parts of the world, not only Germany and the US, which are, of course, first developed countries, but perhaps other parts of the world?
Yes, I think it's similar to sports. I mean, today they were playing something that looked like cricket without grass.
Yeah.
With the, I forget what it's called, but...
the one that you see, yeah.
Right. And just as you have sports that are Spanish sports or Basque sports or Catalan sports, you'll find countries have games that are particular to their countries. What's interesting is that a lot of games have been around long enough in a country that people think, yeah, this is our game. No, sorry, it's not. It came from India, like Parcheesi, Ludo, Mensch Egedischt. All of these came from, the principle came from India. Americans think that Clue is their game because it came out at the same time as Cluedo. But the inventor invented Cluedo. And an American company worked out a deal with a British company so that they would get monopoly if they would give us Cluedo, but Cluedo was too long a name, we'll just call it Clue. So the history has all sorts of interesting information about countries producing their own kind of thing. I've been trying for a long time. I should back up and say it's difficult to find information about certain countries. One, if you don't speak the language, and two, if you don't know whether they are making their own games or whether the games they play are all games from other countries done in their language. And that's still an ongoing research interest of mine, and very difficult to get all that information. I'm looking for, and have been for years, looking for a game that just strikes me as something that's played everywhere, but everybody thinks it's theirs because nobody knows it in any other country. And that is, if anybody recognizes it from this description, you have a little plate in the middle of a table, and you have, each player has like a mouse and a string attached to it, and the mouse is put on the plate, and you have the string, and the player whose turn it is throws die and has a cup. And if he throws, say, a 6, then he covers up the games on the little tray there. What you try to do is when you see that 6, you pull your mouse away so it doesn't get caught, right? And it's done with a cat and mouse theme. The thing is that the player with the cup, after throwing the dice, might throw a 2 and go like that. And somebody pulls away, and of course they lose points because there's no reason to pull away. It's not a 6. He just faked the move. So I've found this game in about 4 or 5 countries so far. Each game has a completely different title, sometimes different animals, sometimes just little figures that don't even, that are pawns, nothing more than that. So I'm getting the feeling, or getting a sense, just intuition, that this game is played everywhere in its own style, and with its own name. So how do you search for something like this when it's got its own name? It's its own game in its own country, even though it's the same as what you have in your country. So that's one of the things.
That's for discussion between countries, between neighbors, especially that you can add them to the food recipes as well, so they can discuss about it. So, Carles estava preguntant sobre altres aspectes que se poden reflexar en els jocs i que donen aquest aspecte cultural diferent, especial, que a totes les cultures ens agrada tindre. I per fer un resum de tot el que ens ha contat Bruce, estàvem dient que a vegades investigar sobre això és molt difícil per problemes lingüístics, perquè no saps com buscar un joc, perquè cada país li ha donat el seu propi nom al joc, perquè du tant de temps aquest joc en aquest país que tothom pensa que és seu i potser està representat, ens ha explicat un joc, que potser està representat en diferents països però li han donat diferents noms. Doncs com investigues això és difícil.
Sí, and I believe we need to go for a wrap now because it's almost 6:30.
Okay.
So we need.
I'm just going to add one quick comment because
please do so.
One of the games that I've been trying to find in every country is called Careers in English, and it does exist in Spain, Carreras, and El Juego de la Vida.
El Juego de la Vida game. Yeah.
And my friends here in Barcelona have been unable to find a copy. So
now, listeners.
Si teniu un joc de la vida, un joc
de la vida, carreras.
And what's interesting is if the game has been produced in the same country for a few years, you look at how the professions have changed, and you look at how the vacation places have changed. So it's interesting when you see that this group was in Mallorca, and the Germans went to Mallorca, and the Dutch went to the South Seas, that kind of thing.
That kind of thing. Si està buscant el joc de la vida, o careers, o carreres, que és un joc que se va adaptant molt a la societat, perquè
sap que està així, així que...
I diu que sap que n'hi ha així a nostra terra. Aleshores, si teniu uno, doncs potser el podeu contactar, perquè està interessat en saber com anar canviant aquest joc al llarg del temps, perquè, clar, les referències canvien, no? I això seria molt interessant.
Thank you for sharing with us this lovely moment.
Thank you, Carla and Carles.
Thanks a lot, Bruce.
Very much. Appreciate it.
We have a very little present for you.
Yes, one present for you.
Just before leaving.
Just as a reminder of
to add into your collection.
Okay. So
thank you. I will use it well.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.